Hey guys, and welcome to this week's Through the Visor. Currently at the apex of Brooklands, heading into Luffield. It's been an awesome weekend, an awesome race. Can't wait to answer your questions about it. So let's get going right now. For those of you new to the channel, I've been a race driver for 20 years, winning the Red Bull kart fight and various national series, before becoming a high-performance driver coach at the world's leading race school for a decade. I was British F4 and F3 test driver, competed at the Race of Champions against current F1 drivers, and I'm a two-time champion of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. I now work as a test driver for a leading tyre manufacturer, driving on the limit every day at tracks all around the world. So I'm back home from Silverstone, and as always you've sent in some excellent questions, and the common theme was a question about the racing demonstrated by the two Red Bull drivers, Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, where they seem to be forcing competitors off the track, and in one instance Perez cut the inside of a corner and potentially gained an advantage. So let's start with the first instance of this that we saw in the event, and that was actually Lewis Hamilton pushing Charles Leclerc off before the first red flag at turn 3. Leclerc attempted to move around the outside and Hamilton left him no room and essentially forced him off the track. And as it happened, that wasn't investigated or penalised because the race was red flagged and it was as if nothing happened. It was as if that was completely cancelled out. So maybe we would have seen an investigation. As it happened, we didn't. Move on to the restart, and we saw a fight between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc going into Brooklands. Charles Leclerc attempted to move again around the outside, and this is a possible move. This is something which does sometimes happen at that corner, and we definitely saw it in the race today. And on the exit, Max left Charles no room at all. Now in this instance, I'm going to give Max Verstappen the benefit of the doubt, because if you take a close look, by the time Verstappen got to the edge of the track and he himself ran a little bit wide, Leclerc didn't really have any kind of overlap. It wasn't like he had any significant portion of his car alongside Max at this point, and this isn't really surprising because it's quite difficult to go around the outside of a car at this corner if the car on the inside carries good speed and really doesn't want you to come through. The only instance in which this would have been really a penalty-worthy move from Verstappen is if Leclerc had managed to keep more of his car alongside Verstappen by the time they got to the apex, and then he would have really earned himself racing room. But in this particular instance, I'd actually say Verstappen was within his rights to go to the edge of the track and cut Leclerc off from continuing that move. Now the more significant one was actually later on, after the safety car had come back in, and we had this battle between Perez, Hamilton and Leclerc on his old used hard tyres. Perez went for a move on Charles Leclerc at the end of the hangar straight, trying to go down the inside into Stowe, and they were side by side pretty much all the way down to Vale to the next chicane. Perez then tried to make that move around the outside of the final chicane, and that is a move which sometimes comes off. Leclerc left him very little room, and Perez then cut the inside of the corner, all four wheels off the track, before then forcing Leclerc again off the track on the exit. And this is where Lewis Hamilton nipped through and drove past both of them. Now in this instance, it's a little bit tricky because Perez didn't have a lot of room to exist on the exit. It's a very tight corner. It's a reasonably low percentage move unless you're pretty well ahead at the turning point on the outside, and Perez eventually was forced to cut the track to avoid making contact to the apex with Leclerc. The thing I take issue with here maybe slightly is that he gained a lasting advantage by cutting the corner and then by running Leclerc wide on the exit. And I'm not saying that's deliberate, but it was just the nature of the way the physics played out in that corner with the tightness of the corner and two cars trying to go side by side through there. Leclerc was forced off, Perez managed to then keep his foot down after cutting the corner, and that then put him in a position to attack Hamilton going into turn 3 on the following lap. Without that, had he been forced to cede that position back to Leclerc and maybe give up a bit of ground, then maybe it would have played out a little bit differently in the fight with Hamilton later on in that lap. But this flowed immediately into another one of these controversial running a driver off track moves that we're talking about. Perez went down the inside of Hamilton into turn 3 and left him no room on the exit. Hamilton was forced to go all four wheels off and then also lost a place to Charles Leclerc as a result. Now the initial move from Perez, we really can't take issue with. It was a great move down the inside. The door was open, and we're going to talk about this later in one of the other questions, and he went through that gap. The thing we're going to question slightly is the fact he left zero room on the exit to a car which seemed to still be alongside. Hamilton had taken more of an ideal line into that corner, having left that space on the inside, and that allowed him to carry a bit more speed, and that allowed him to stay on the outside of Perez. But at that point, Perez drove all the way to the edge of the track and forced Hamilton all the way off the circuit. This is probably the most clear cut of all of these moves, in which I'd say that a penalty was probably justified. I was quite surprised that Perez didn't end up with a 5-second penalty for this. And although you could say that given the precedent of the other moves earlier in the race, the Verstappen one we were talking about and a couple of others, maybe the stewards were just being more lenient in this particular race, but I don't think that's a great excuse because this was slightly different. Hamilton had more of an overlap, and this really was the kind of move we've seen penalised in the past, especially with this year's rules clarifications which say you do have to leave racing room if a car is legitimately one space alongside you. I think it's slightly dangerous to set this new precedent where we're going back to the old style rules. This is kind of what we saw a lot in 2021 because it really makes the racing worse. If people are allowed to just barge their competitors off the circuit, it means the racing we see stops really quickly. We don't get to see battles which last corner after corner because you know you can just run your competitor wide and then get on with your race without having to continue that fight. The final questionable moves we saw in terms of defending and forcing drivers off the track were between Verstappen and Mick Schumacher. And I have to say, for me, this is pretty clear cut. Schumacher had a very legitimate overlap on Verstappen. And in this instance, unlike with Leclerc on the first lap, Schumacher had won legitimate space on the exit and Verstappen just did not give it to him. He really forced him off the track despite Schumacher being there. He was in the gap, he'd won that room, and Verstappen drove clean to the edge of the track and forced him off. This for me is an absolutely clear-cut 5-second penalty, and the second instance in this race where a driver has somehow avoided a 5-second penalty because the stewards are being surprisingly lenient. There was then a further move on the final corner of the race where Schumacher managed to get up the inside of Verstappen, and Verstappen drove directly to the apex of the final corner and forced Schumacher to back out to avoid contact. And again, not really a fair move. You tend to get away with something like that a bit more because it's so close to the finish line. And I know that shouldn't be the case, but it's just what tends to happen, especially because no contact did ensue. Had Schumacher stayed in that gap and Verstappen had made contact and they'd had a crash, perhaps they would have taken a look at it and deemed one driver to be at fault. But at the very least, Verstappen got away with one potential 5-second penalty that he should have received. And as I've said before, I'm not a fan of this kind of thing being allowed to slide, because it really does kill good racing going forward. I'm hoping this is a one-off example because Silverstone is actually quite a safe place to run someone wide. They don't lose as much time as they would at other circuits. It's generally tarmac or asphalt that they're being forced onto rather than grass, and maybe the stewards were just in a mindset where they didn't want penalties to detract from the racing action. But that really isn't how those things should work, and it really just should be consistent across the board. So for my mind, we should be more strictly penalising this particular kind of move because it leads to better, fairer, cleaner racing going forward. So that leads us quite nicely into the next question, which is about why Hamilton left the door open on the inside to turn 3 and allowed Perez through in that instance in the first place. Now this is a pattern we've seen a few times now from Hamilton where he's almost been too clean, too nice to the attacking car in allowing them a lot of room on the inside to make a move. You could argue we saw this exact same thing at Abu Dhabi last year when Verstappen made the move to win the championship. It seems like Hamilton is in a mindset where discretion is the better part of valour, and he's gotten used to having a car with which he can always fight back later, and it doesn't matter if he lets the place go right now. It's kind of better to be safe, preserve the car, and live to fight another day. But that isn't really the case with this year's Mercedes.
Lewis, we all know that this is a bit of a shit box to drive at the moment.
You do really need to fight over every position and try and keep each one. And I do feel maybe he was too nice to Perez here. Having said that, you could argue though that in Hamilton's mind, for Perez to make that move cleanly, he would have had to leave him more room on the exit, he would have had to be slower at the apex, and therefore Hamilton would have probably retained the position going into the following corner. And it was only because Perez didn't manage to make the corner legally and was then forced to force Lewis off on the exit that he managed to get through. So actually maybe Lewis judged it correctly. Maybe he defended just the right amount, but really it was the stewards not policing that move correctly that was at fault. But either way, I do think Hamilton could have prevented the move from happening in the first place just by positioning his car slightly further to the right and not allowing Perez to come down the inside at all. At Silverstone, there's quite a few corners that switch back on themselves. So the inside for one corner then becomes the outside for another corner. And this is definitely one of those examples. Hamilton may well have just thought that he didn't want to be compromised for the following corner. And in his mind, the judgment he made in that moment was that he'd be able to get through the gap that Perez was obliged to leave him, and he would then be able to be in a better position for the tight hairpin left, which then leads onto the Wellington straight. but because he was forced off, that never materialised. As much as it pains me to say this, I don't think the drivers at the moment can rely on the consistency of the stewards. So they need to take things into their own hands in as much as not putting themselves in a position where they're relying on a good call being made afterwards. But in one final defence of Hamilton for this particular scenario we're talking about, had Perez not been allowed to keep a lasting advantage from the end of the previous lap that we discussed earlier, and then gotten away with running him wide on the exit of turn 3, then all of the decisions Hamilton made were actually the correct ones. So I don't want to be too harsh on him for leaving this particular door open. If you've made it this far through the video, you're obviously enjoying the content, so please give it a like and subscribe below, as it helps me promote these videos to more people and lets me know that we're doing something right. So on to the next question. Why did Verstappen initially think that his car had a puncture when it received the floor damage? Now, this is a really good opportunity to explain how drivers assess what's wrong with a car and why it's handling in a certain way. And I would suggest that maybe Verstappen just felt a loss of grip in one area, maybe around the left rear for example. Maybe the piece of bodywork that was lodged under the car was blocking a particular part of the floor, causing him to lose grip in that part of the car. Say it was the left rear, when he turned right, he would get a snap in a similar way to a deflating tyre. Now the differences really are when you do have a genuine puncture, you tend to feel a bit more body roll. When you turn the car into a corner, the car leans over a little bit more than you're expecting. And obviously the more the tyre deflates, the bigger the loss of grip, the more the body roll, and the more the car will start to slide in that particular area. If you have a puncture on the left front, you'll get a lot of understeer in right-handers. If you have a puncture on the left rear, you'll get a lot of oversteer in right-handers, and so on. And I suspect that Verstappen was feeling something akin to this, although you can hear from the radio messages, he wasn't certain that that's what it was, and the moment they changed tyres and he still had that problem, he knew it definitely wasn't a puncture, and he actually said the car is 100% broken. We know how much this year's cars rely on their underbody downforce, and with something blocking one of those tunnels, he obviously lost a dramatic amount of downforce, which will have been quite disconcerting having gone through the whole weekend with the car handling very differently. He will have had to spend the first few laps learning how the car responds and adapting to it. And as with all of the best drivers, they adapt to that very quickly, and it turns out the performance of that car in the end was barely as good as a Haas. What was it like to be at Silverstone over the weekend? So as you will have seen, I was at the track and it was great, the weather was good on the race day, but really over the whole weekend it was just a great experience. And I'd fully recommend anyone who hasn't been to a race before to go to the British Grand Prix. In fact, book your tickets as soon as they become available, because as a fan, it's really evolved into a great all-round experience where you're never left bored or hungry or wondering what to do next. The action on track is good because the circuit is good. Silverstone just lends itself to good racing with this generation of cars. It's wide, it's smooth, it's fast, and it's got good switchback corners like we discussed earlier, where cars can really battle corner after corner after corner. And that isn't the case with a lot of the tracks we go to over the season, where they're twisty or bumpy or not really conducive to overtaking. With Silverstone, you feel like you're at a place that has really grown with Formula One, and the facilities on site for a spectator are just appropriate for Formula One in 2022. Even without a grandstand ticket, you can really walk to plenty of places around the track and get a good view. If you arrive relatively early in the morning, you'll get an excellent view, better than a lot of the grandstand seats. If you want hospitality and you've got the money to pay for that, there's brilliant paddock club and other VIP hospitality areas all around the track. And in terms of food, although some of the American contingent weren't too happy with my giant Yorkshire pudding I posted on Twitter, there's so much choice, everyone will be able to find something that they like. Getting in and out of the track can be tricky, as with any race, especially with such a sold out event like this with 400,000 people. I didn't get home till reasonably late last night, despite living quite nearby. But if a bit of traffic coming in and out of the circuit is the worst part of the weekend, then really it's a good advert for what a great event the British Grand Prix is. So wholeheartedly recommend it, get yourself to Silverstone, and just make sure you bring an umbrella and sun cream. So it's under a week until the next Grand Prix. It's the Austrian Grand Prix next weekend, a track where Red Bull tends to go well, pretty different circuit to Silverstone, and a lot of Max Verstappen support at that one, in contrast to the support for the Brits we had this weekend. I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about there as well, so please remember to send your questions in on Twitter, and I'll see you after the Austrian Grand Prix.